All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry, we started a little late, but we were just waiting for a few more people to join us. Today's webinar is with Shamid Abraham, and we're covering F8. My name is Tweeps Woods, and I'm representing the ACCA office in the US. Before we start this presentation, please remember to mute yourself. If you have any questions, you can feel free to write them in the chat section as we go along. If you can just make sure to keep any, while you're on mute, obviously, just make sure that you keep that up because I know it's lunch and people often want to eat. So just keep yourself on mute. That's the most important thing so we can get started. All right, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Shamid.
Thank you very much, Tweeps. Are you okay? So are you guys seeing my? Are you seeing the presentation there?
Yes, we can see it now. Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you very much, Tweeps, and good day, everyone. Thank you all for logging in on time. Today's session would be focused on the F8 exam, which it would sort of be impossible to achieve, in 1 hour teaching you everything about the F8 exam. But it's really to focus on the exam techniques and the skills which are critical in order to achieve a pass in this exam, which, by the way, is due in about 20 days' time. Today's session, in terms of the agenda, would cover, I'm basically aiming to cover the 5 main areas within the F8 exam, together with the current format of the exam and some general exam technique pointers. And then I will conclude with the issue that would be upon us sometime soon, that is probably facing a lot of you guys right now, the issue of attempting these exams via computer-based exams. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Feel free to, message through your questions as they come up, and as I said, we'll deal with it at the end of the session. The first thing that I would like to deal with is the format of the exam, and more specifically the section A of the exam. The section A of this exam is extremely critical. It carries 30 marks in this exam. It is basically a part of the exam that you should be spending at least 1 hour on. If I have a question in this exam that equates to 30 marks, which the objective test questions, equate to, if these questions equate to 30 marks in this exam, that actually is, it's a huge chunk of the exam. Now, these questions are basically, what we would traditionally refer to as multiple choice questions, but they are a lot more than multiple choice questions. They are exactly what they are referred to as objective test cases. In other words, they're 3 short scenarios with 5 questions each, carrying 2 marks each. Now, a lot of students are struggling through these questions because of the not allocating enough time and not planning a proper approach to these questions. These questions, first and foremost, in terms of strategy, should be attempted first in the exam. Why you should be attempting these questions first in the exam is because, in the first few minutes of an exam, you're a little bit tentative, you don't want to put pen to paper, and these are the questions that are perfect for getting out of the blocks in the exam, where you don't have to put pen to paper, you don't have to write anything, you don't have to explain anything. It's just about reading the scenarios and answering the questions. However, very important, in terms of attempting these questions, you must plan and allocate your time properly as you are doing this. So in other words, the first 5 questions ought to be done. You know, this is 5 questions, 2 marks each, 10. So you're supposed to be, you know, looking at the first 5 questions to be completed in 18 minutes. Then the second batch of 5 questions at the end of 36 minutes, and then the last 5 questions at the end of 54 minutes in the exam. So it is absolutely critical that you ought to be timing yourself through these blocks of questions. The examiner has stated that these questions can be quite challenging. Good. And the examiner, in the words of the examiner, is saying that I think that sometimes it's an area of the exam that students have not fully appreciated, that these questions can be quite challenging. The examiner is also saying that these questions take time to read and understand. And again, what I just had been hinting at, that students are not allowing enough time for this part of the exam. These questions require knowledge. The F8 exam, to be successful in the F8 exam, you ought to have a 50% split of knowledge and application skills. So these questions require you to know all areas of the syllabus. In the words of the examiner, in the last bullet point there, having 15 objective test questions allow greater syllabus coverage. Students must learn and practice the entire syllabus. So these questions are extremely critical. You ought to know your material. It's either you know the work or you don't know the work, and you should be timing yourself through this area of the exam. It is absolutely critical. So again, you should be attempting it first, and you should be timing yourself, and it requires you to know the material and know and to have the technical knowledge for this part of the exam. The section B, it's really the written questions, 1 word 30 marks and a 20-mark question. I think you probably know that by now. So I'm going to get into the other areas of the syllabus now that would probably manifest itself in that section B. The first area of the syllabus that it appears in these areas that I'm going to get into appears in every single F8 exam. Questions relating to ethics, questions relating to corporate governance, extremely critical. With respect to ethics, major weaknesses, or the common requirement, before we get into the weaknesses, the common requirement in the F8 exam is to identify and explain 5, well, not 5, but I have the example there as being 5, but identify and explain ethical threats, and then to explain how these threats could be reduced. Now, a lot of us, most students, can properly identify the threat, but not a lot of us are actually explaining the threat properly. And if you are identifying the threat and you are not explaining it properly, then you're not doing yourself any justice in the exam. What do I mean by explain the threat? Explain the threat is not a definition of the threat. Explain the threat is to say how that specific scenario creates an environment where the auditor's objectivity or independence is being compromised. So just to use a common example here, on the right-hand side of that table there, if the scenario says that the finance director is the sister-in-law of the audit partner, a weak answer says that the finance director is the sister-in-law of the audit partner, and hence there's a familiarity threat. Now, the thing about that is that you probably get a half mark for identifying the threat, the familiarity threat, but you have not really explained it. You have attempted to explain it, but all you've done is literally regurgitate the information out of the question. There are some key words that the marker is looking for. So a familiarity threat, the good answer says that there's a familiarity threat because of the relationship. It causes the partner to reduce his professional skepticism during the course of the audit. Because he's related to this person, he may not approach the audit with the necessary level of skepticism. Or because he's related to this person, he may fail to question the finance director sufficiently. So it's just a word, it's just a phrase, it's just a few extra words, but it ought to be related to. Okay, I think we have an issue with a couple people not having muted their microphones here.
Please, if I can remind everyone to mute themselves when you get on, thank you.
Yeah, so what we have here is that, it's just a few extra. Uh, Hello? Yeah, so what we have here is just a few extra words. It's just a phrase that is required to properly explain the threat. So you have to question yourself, am I just regurgitating the information from the question, or am I properly explaining how the auditor's objectivity will be compromised? Now, the other major problem that we have in the F8 exam is that together with the ethical threats, there's a part of that question that is asking you for a safeguard, that is asking you for how could the threat be reduced to an acceptable level. What is the recommendation? The recommendation must be brief, it must be practical. So if I am saying that the finance director has this close relationship with a key member, the client, a key client, staff as being the accountant and so forth, then the recommendation is that the partner should be removed and an alternative one appointed. I just didn't say that the partner should be removed. I'm trying to be as practical as possible and say that an alternative one should be appointed. So that's a little bit about the ethics. Ensure that when you look at the ethics questions, that you are ensuring that you are not just regurgitating the information, but you are explaining the threat. The other sort of questions that appear in the F8 exam related to corporate governance. And it's another area that we are being asked to identify and explain weaknesses and also provide a recommendation. The weakness and what the examiner is saying, that a lot of students are able to identify again but not explain. You get an immediate half mark for identifying something, but the other half mark ought to be a proper explanation. So you can't say that you're seeing some weakness, you have identified it as a weakness, but then say that this is not good corporate governance. That is not an explanation of a weakness. An explanation of a weakness is, how does it affect the business? How does this affect the business? So if I, on the right hand side, I have an example. If the scenario says that the remuneration for directors is set by the finance director, good. If you are explaining that and you're saying that no director should be involved in setting their remuneration, you have identified a weakness. But you have not explained what is the implication of the finance director setting remuneration. You've identified it, but you have not gone on to explain what's the implication. The implication is that it could result in excessive levels of pay being set. It could result in financial losses for the business. It could result in abuse of power in terms of setting remuneration. So again, you can't stop at identifying something but not explaining it properly. And the weakness in the F8 exam is that a lot of students are defaulting to regurgitating the information out of the question, thinking that that is an explanation. An explanation is an implication of something that you have identified. That is what an explanation is. A recommendation now for corporate governance weaknesses, recommendations must again be practical. And the major problem that we are having in the F8 exams is that a lot of people are explaining a recommendation as an objective. So in the middle column of that table on the slide there, the recommendations provided were not adequate. Good. Given objectives saying that the board should be balanced between executive and non-executives to ensure that the board makes the correct decisions. That is an objective. That is not a recommendation. A recommendation, if we have identified a weakness in terms of the executive management setting remuneration, the recommendation ought to be practical again. And it's simpler than you think. It's just to say that the non-executive directors should decide on the remuneration of the executive directors, and a little bit extra in terms of the practical nature of that scenario. The finance director should decide on the pay of, or the chairman should decide on the pay of the non-executives. So non-executives deciding on remuneration for executives and vice versa. That is a practical recommendation. That is something that you could look at your client and recommend. So when you write recommendations in the exam, you need to ask yourself, is this something that I could take to a client? Is it something that is practical? Good, because a practical recommendation is not to say that we should ensure that the board makes, proper decisions, let's just say. So ensure is an objective. Check is an objective. A recommendation ought to be something that you can, as I said, take to the client and they can implement it. The other area of the F8 exam, massive area of the F8 exam, relates to planning, audit planning and risk assessment, understanding audit risk and all the issues that relate to planning and audit, analytical procedures and that sort of thing. Now, this sort of question could appear in the exam. It is highly examinable. It could appear in the exam in those objective test questions as little scenarios. It could appear in the exam as a regurgitation type knowledge-based question asking you to define audit risk and explain the elements of audit risk. Or it could be in the context of a scenario asking you to identify the audit risk and explain the auditor's response. So in the F8 exam, again, asking you again to identify and explain something and to give a response in this instance. So you ought to know, what is audit risk. It is basically the risk that the auditors issue the wrong opinion on the financial statements. And that is a combination of two factors. It is the fact that the financial statements could contain errors and that the auditors fail to detect it. What could create errors in the financial statements? Inherent risk factors and control risk factors. In terms of the scenarios, because there are big questions in the F8 exam based on audit risk in relation to scenarios. How do I identify and explain an audit risk? So I have a short sentence here taken out of a scenario from the June 2016 exam. The company has ordered 720,000 of plant and machinery, 2/3 of which may not have been received at year end. What is an example of a audit risk? How do I explain audit risk? There are a few things that your answer must have in an explanation of audit risk. Your answer must state the area of the financial statements that are impacted, and it must describe the impact. So every description of audit risk must contain the area of the accounts that is affected, in this case, property, plant, and equipment, and your answer must contain the words over or understated or misstated, depending on the scenario. So it must also explain the financial statement impact. How do I get to that point? Sometimes, some words that we may want to have in our answer, sometimes the financial statement assertions may help us in that regard. For example, existence in this situation. So basically, we have ordered some plant and machinery, but we're not sure if we're going to receive it at year end. So only assets which physically exist at year end should be included in property, plant, and equipment. So I've gotten a half mark because I've identified a particular accounting issue here. Because audit risk relates to the financial statements. They're things that affect the financial statements. And a lot of the times for me to get to the audit risk, it deals with an accounting issue. So the accounting issue here is that only assets which exist should be accounted for as an asset. If items, and then I'm moving on to say what the risk is. A lot of us are going into the exam, we know the accounting treatment, we're discussing certain things, but we are not telling the marker what the risk is. The risk is if items are not yet delivered, have been capitalized. So the risk is that we have accounted for assets which are not physically existing. So if arrived, if we've done that, I have to tell the marker now what is the financial statement impact that property, plant, and equipment will be overstated. So it's a very simple explanation. What is the accounting issue? The issue is that only PPE that exists should be capitalized, and the risk is that if that was not done, then PPE will be overstated. That key word that I must have in my answer, what is overstated, understated, or misstated? So again, there are two things that must come together in your explanation of risk. You must know the accounting treatment, and you must be able to say what is the financial statement impact. So there are lots of people going into the F8 exam without having the accounting knowledge that is required to pass this exam. And in terms of the accounting knowledge that is required to pass this exam, it is everything that you would have done at the F3 level, the F3 exam, in terms of those standards that are examinable in the F3 exam. How would you know what are these standards that are examinable? If you go to the examinable material under the F8 website, you will see that you're being directed to all of the examinable material relating to the F3 exam. Okay, the other aspect of planning, of an audit risk question is that after you've identified and explained the audit risk, the examiner is now asking you to give a response by the auditor, not management. What are the elements of a good auditor's response? It doesn't have to be any sort of detailed audit procedures. It should be a response by the auditor, not management. So a lot of us give a response, and it's really business advice. You're given a response as if it is something that you're telling management to do. It should also not be vague. It should also not start with check or ensure, because a response is what the auditors are going to do. And a lot of us write, answers in the exam: check this, check that, ensure this, ensure that. Those are objectives. Those are not responses. What is an example of a response? Discuss, relating to the scenario that we just had. So the risk was that there's a possibility that we have accounted for assets which do not physically exist. What is the auditor's response? Discuss with management. Discuss is an action word. It's something that we're doing, which is a response. Discuss with management as to whether the remaining PPE ordered have arrived. If so, physically verify it. So I'm getting a half mark for identifying that I should physically verify the assets, but I'm concluding with the ensure. To ensure or to check. So what I've done in my procedure there is that I've said what I'm going to do, and I've said why in a simple sentence. We are not passing the exam. A lot of people struggling to pass the F8 exam because they can't finish the exam because they're writing a lot more than is required for 1 mark. So physically verify the assets to ensure exists that only appropriate assets are recorded. So again, it's a simple sentence, but there are certain things that you must have in the response. It must be something that the auditors will do. It's what they're gonna do and why. Another area of the F8 exam is, relates to internal controls. You can pick up any F8 exam and you're guaranteed to find a big question on internal controls, and what sort of manifests itself in the exam: identify and explain internal control deficiencies or sometimes strengths, recommend controls to address the deficiencies, describe tests of controls, describe control objectives. These are things that are completely different from each other. A control is something that we've put in place. It is different from a test of a control, and that is also different from the objective of a test. So what are the common weaknesses? That the tests of the controls are often not well explained, using check, again, very vague. A lot of us are confused over what are tests of controls versus substantive procedures. And then again, the recommendations are really poorly described. So, I have an example here, but, I just want to give you another example, in terms of the differences between what a control is, what a test of a control is, and what the control objective is. So a control is a bank reconciliation. So a bank reconciliation is the control. The test of the control is to say, obtain a sample of bank reconciliations and inspect for signatures for approval. That is the test that the auditors are doing. So the control is the bank rec, what management has put in place. The test is what the auditors are doing, and the objective is what the bank rec is meant to prevent. So the objective of the control is to minimize misappropriation of cash, good, or fraudulent activity related to cash. Those three things are completely different. So when we explain these things in the exam, our answers must reflect the fact that we understand that there's a massive difference between those three things. So I've taken a deficiency here on the slide that you see in there. The wages calculations are generated by the payroll system and there are no checks performed. I've gotten a half mark out of the scenario for saying that there are no checks. But if I have to explain a deficiency, I can't stop there. I have to go on now to say, so what is the implication of the business of that deficiency, which could result in wages being over or under calculated, leading to additional costs or loss of goodwill. So again, you are seeing here where these things are simple sentences. And every time I have ID'd something, every time I have identified something, I'm going to say what the implication is for what I identified. Now look at the recommendation. I've told you from the start that recommendations or controls, anything that you are recommending must be practical. It must be something that you can tell the client and they can quickly implement, that they can understand it to implement it. So if there are no checks performed, my recommendation is that a senior member of the team should recalculate workings for a sample and compare the results to the output from the payroll system. These calculations should be signed and approved before payments are made. It's practical. I can look at the client and say that a senior member of the payroll team should check the payroll and that it should be signed and approved, basically. Good. I could have said that in a lot less words in any case. What is the test? Now, the control is what management will be implementing. The test of the control, that the bias and the tone has changed completely. That is a test that the auditors will be doing. So if I am checking, if the control is that someone should be overseeing the calculations and signing it for approval, then the test that the auditors will be performing is to review a sample of those calculations, half mark. But again, why? I have identified again the test, and I'm always saying what the implication is or why I'm doing something. Review a sample of the calculations and why. for evidence that they have undertaken the checks and signed as approved. Simple. To pass this exam, it is all about simple sentences. You cannot expect to be writing 5, 6, 7 sentences to attract 1 mark in the exam. You will never finish the exam. The other area of the F8 exam that is causing a lot of problems for students is the difference between tests of controls and substantive procedures, audit evidence. Substantive procedures, how would this be, and it is an area of the exam that you cannot afford to go into the exam and not be strong on, because substantive procedures are all over this exam. It could be in the 30-mark scenario question in the section B. It could be in the short scenarios. It could be as a theory question in the exam. It could be in the objective test cases as well. So it can be all over this exam. So what constitutes a description of a good audit procedure or substantive procedure? There must be 3 things that you must have in when you are writing a substantive procedure. It must be what you are doing. In other words, inspecting, calculating, observing, discussing. It must start off with an action word. It must contain audit evidence, and it must be completed by why. So it must be, if I were to say, I have an example actually on the next slide here. So on the next slide, I have some examples of tests of controls and substantive procedures. What is the difference? The difference is that a test of a control is just rarely done to figure out if something is working as it should. The substantive procedure, the objective of a substantive procedure is to verify whether a figure in the financial statements is correct or not. So going back to my bank rec explanation, the test of the control obtain a sample of bank reconciliations to determine and inspect for signatures. If the bank recs are signed for approval, then I have confirmed. That is the test of the control. Obtain a sample of the bank recs and test for signatures. All that is telling me is that there are bank recs being performed as they should and they're being approved. That is the test of the control. The test of the control is really to tell me whether the controls are working as they should. But that will never tell me whether the cash figure is correct or not. A substantive procedure will tell me if the cash figure is correct or not. Whether the bank recs are signed is not going to tell me whether the cash figure is correct or not. However, if I were to look at, if I were to say something like obtain a sample of, obtain the year-end bank statement. Again, I'm going back to audit this. That is a substantive procedure. What you're doing, I'm obtaining. What am I obtaining? I am obtaining audit evidence being the bank statement and why. So if I were to say obtain the year-end bank statement and trace the ending balance to the cash book or the cash book or the bank reconciliation or something, that is the reason. So I've had now the audit evidence being the bank statement, and I'm stating a reason. So if I look on the right hand side of this table here, this is an example of a substantive procedure. Calculate the average receivable days. That is what I'm doing. I've gotten a half mark for that, but I'm not saying why. And compare it to the prior year to indicate any possible overstatement. That if my receivables have gone up, if my receivable days have gone up, it could indicate that my receivables and I'm having difficulty collecting them. Then there may be some there that are not collectible and therefore overstated. So a substantive procedure is a simple thing again. It must have audit evidence. Look down below. Select a sample of goods dispatch notes. That is audit evidence. That is what I'm doing. I'm selecting what? I'm selecting a sample of goods received, of goods delivery notes just before and just after year end. And why am I doing it? I'm following it, I'm tracing it to the sales invoice, but why? To ensure that they're recorded in the correct accounting period. So you need to prepare yourself for this exam. To prepare yourself for this exam, in terms of substantive procedures, you need to go back to every single F8 question with substantive procedures, look to see how they are described in the answers, look for the components of the procedure. Where is the audit evidence, and where are they saying why they are doing what they are doing? Now, a little bit back to the controls. How do I extract controls from a case study? And a lot of us, again, back to that control question. A lot of us are struggling to find the controls in the question. Good. And when we can't find the controls, then one of the reasons why we default to writing procedures that are really substantive procedures. So again, we need to be very clear in the exam. What is a control? What is a test of a control? How is it different from a substantive procedure? I have highlighted here all of the controls in this scenario. A unique customer account number. That is, a unique customer account number is a control. Now, just by the way, what is the test of the control? So if that is a control, the test of the control is a simple procedure. How do I challenge as an auditor that control? How do I test that control? If the control is that every customer has a unique customer account number, then the test of the control is that the auditor should attempt to enter a fictitious customer number to confirm that the system will reject it. That's a simple test. The objective is completely different. The objective of having that control is to ensure that only orders from legitimate or valid customers are being processed. So again, when you look at these questions, look to see where they are the controls. The controls exist in those things. The controls are always around documents. The controls are always around processes. Orders are entered by an order clerk. That is a process. The system automatically checks it. That's a process. That it will not take a customer over their credit limit. The manager completes a credit application. That's a document. That's a control. That there's a credit application process or document being completed. It is checked through a credit agency. That's a process. Good. So the thing about looking for these controls, you ought to be able to find them and then be able to properly explain the difference between the test and the objective. Now back to the substantive procedures, because I had mentioned that you could be asked to explain some substantive procedures from short scenarios. So here I have a short scenario from the 2012 June exam. How can I find procedures? Where will I find, how can I derive substantive procedures from these scenarios? They are literally dropping out of the scenario. They're literally there in the information, but we are not paying close attention to the information. Pineapple's directors receive correspondence. That is something that is audit evidence. Audit evidence is something that the auditors can touch. It is something that we can investigate. It is something that we can look at. So a substantive procedure is the audit evidence, as I said, and why. So if the directors have received correspondence, look at the procedure below. Review. It starts off with an action word. Review what? The correspondence from the customers. I've gotten a half mark. That is the audit evidence, but I have to complete it to say why. Why am I looking at the correspondence from the customers? To assess whether the company has some sort of present obligation arising out of the claim. Good. There are lots of different reasons. We could say review the correspondence from the customers to assess the extent of damages, to assess the details related to the claim. Anything like that would work. But again, make sure you understand that I have the two elements of what a substantive procedure should have in it: audit, evidence, and why. Good. Another thing that I could have said as a substantive procedure: send an inquiry letter to the lawyers. Inquiry letter to the lawyers, audit, evidence, but why? To obtain their view as to the probability of the claim being successful. Review board minutes. We like the board minutes thing in the exam, but we just go in the exam and we say review board minutes, but not saying why. To understand why the directors believe that the claim will be successful or not. And all of those things are really substantive procedures. It's really the work that the auditors will do, but why we are doing it. And if you have those two components, you have audit, evidence in it, and you have why, you're sure to pick up 1 mark in the exam. The last area of the F8 exam refers to, that review stage of the audit. Now, I deliberately did not say audit reports. I'm saying the review stage of the audit. When we have questions in the exam relating to audit risk, that is coming out of the planning stage of the audit. But there's an area of the audit, the last stage of the audit, referred to as the review stage of the audit, where there are lots of little players that exist in the review stage of the audit that you ought to know about. You have to know about this stuff. Good. Subsequent events. What are the auditor's responsibilities with respect to events after the balance sheet date? The accounting aspect of it in IAS 10, as well as the auditor's responsibilities. Going concern is a review that the auditors do. At the review stage of the audit, you must be able to identify indicators of going concern, as well as the auditor's responsibilities with respect to going concern. Written representations, another example of the things that the auditors will be doing at the review stage of the audit, that they will be looking and requesting the representation letter. And as I mentioned, the representation letter, good, there are 4 letters in the F8 syllabus that you have to know everything about. 2 of the letters exist at the start of the audit, and 2 of the letters exist at the end of the audit. The first one is at the start of the audit, is the letter of professional etiquette, which we as prospective auditors will write to the current auditors, asking them if there are any reasons of a professional nature or otherwise why we should not take on the audit. Then you have the engagement letter, which is the letter that is the contract between us and the client, which we will sign once we have determined that we want to accept this audit. And then the last 2 is at the end, where you will issue what you refer to as a management letter, which is a letter of internal control weaknesses that is completely different from the management representation letter, which is a letter of, listing all of the things that we asked management about, that we wanted to, just because of the nature of those queries, we wanted to put it in writing to cover ourselves. So all of these letters, you must know the characteristics of them, the things that you will have in them, who is writing it, who is signing it, who is it addressed to. Good. But the representation letter is one of those things that you will have at the review stage of the audit. Now, at the review stage of the audit, we also have the issue of audit reports. And audit reports and qualifications of qualified opinions and so forth is another weak area for students in this exam. And you ought to know that there's been a new auditor's report. There have been articles on the website about it. If you're studying current material, you should have, the new auditor's report and those articles, and you have to know the elements of the new auditor's report. In terms of questions in the F8 exam, a question on audit reports will require accounting knowledge. It requires you to know what the correct accounting treatment is. Because if something has been treated incorrectly, then it could impact on the auditor's report, because there could be an area that is over or understated, and then you will have to describe the implications on the opinion or the implications on the audit report. The implications on the opinion, whether it is qualified or unqualified, is massively different from the implication for the auditor's report. The auditor's report is the physical changes in the auditor's report. For example, if we have a qualified opinion, good, then you have to say that there will, in the basis of opinion paragraph, there will be a description and a financial, quantification of the issue related to the qualification. Now, as I am speaking about qualification, it is an area that really a weak area for students in the F8 exam, not being able to determine whether an opinion is qualified or not. And whenever you're faced with an audit reports question in the exam, trying to figure out whether I should be given a qualified opinion or not, it is a very simple approach to arrive at your answer. There are only two circumstances. So I have the table here on the slide there. On the left-hand side, there are only two circumstances of things that could create a qualified opinion. One, that the financial statements are misstated, meaning there's an error. One, that there's an error in the accounts, that some accounting treatment has not been followed, which includes lack of disclosure as well. Or that there's a limitation in scope. What does a limitation in scope means? A limitation in scope means that the auditors, for whatever reason, the auditors were not able to carry out the necessary audit work because they've been prevented from obtaining audit evidence. Then, when you ask yourself, do I have circumstances for a qualification? If the answer to that is yes, then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the effect? Is it material alone, or is it material and pervasive? Material and pervasive is if there's an error in the accounts and it completely renders the financial statements completely useless. For example, there's an error that if corrected, it would have changed a profit into a loss. Or if the accounts were prepared on a going concern basis, but the company is not going to continue, those accounts are completely useless. So the next thing you ask yourself, is it material? If it is material, you give a qualified except for opinion. Lots of us are going into the exam and saying all sorts of different words other than the exact opinion. The exact wording, if it is a misstatement and it is material alone, it's referred to as a qualified except for opinion. If it is a pervasive error, it's an adverse opinion. If it is a limitation in scope, again, it's an except for opinion. There are two except fors. And if it is a limitation that is pervasive, it will just be a disclaimer opinion. Now, opinions and qualification are, in terms of, due to time constraints, I obviously can't get into the details there because, I normally teach audit reports and it would take a 3-hour lecture to teach this stuff. All right, so this is something that you need to be really, really clear upon before you go into the exam. So let's just take a quick example of what we mean by qualified and unqualified and how we get to the opinion. In this scenario, they're saying that during the audit, the audit team discovered that there are some development projects valued at a certain amount included within intangible assets that do not meet the criteria for capitalization. The question is saying, describe the impact on the audit report. There are things that your answer must have in it. This is a 4-mark question. 4 marks in the exam means that really there are about 8 half marks for you to obtain. So for me to get marks in the exam, I have to know the accounting treatment, the accounting issue. We can't go into the exam not having the accounting knowledge. So what is the accounting knowledge? And again, it's not a complete regurgitation of the whole standard. Now, in my answer here, I have IAS 38 intangible assets. You get no credit in the exam for regurgitating the title of the standard and the number of the standard. So that was not even required. All that was required for a half mark is to say, good, that if the project does not meet the criteria for capitalizing it as an intangible asset, then the 980,000 is really research expenditure and should be expensed. Research expenditure should be expensed. I could have said that alone and could have gotten the half mark, but where is that half mark coming from? The accounting treatment, accounting knowledge that I have to know about. So I've gotten another half mark for another very simple sentence, because the finance director made a statement saying that it is immaterial. The things that we are not doing in the exam, stating the obvious. The obvious thing is to say that the finance director's argument that the balance is immaterial is not correct. I've gotten a half mark for that. But another thing about the audit reports questions, there's a mark out of those 4 marks for a materiality calculation. Because going back to this table, I cannot decide whether something is qualified. I can't determine which one out of the 4 qualified opinions is relevant in a question unless I calculate materiality. I have to know whether it is material. For me to determine whether it is material, I have to perform a calculation, and you have to know about the materiality calculations and the thresholds going into the exam. I don't have the information there in terms of assets and whatever, but in this case, we've calculated it as being 11.8% of profits before tax, and I've gotten 2 half marks. I've gotten a half mark for saying material. The only thing the marker is interested in is the word material, whether it is material or not, and the calculation. Now, I'm getting more marks in the exam now to get to the correct opinion. The question said that management does not intend to change the accounting treatment. Go back, ask yourself, do I have circumstances for a qualification? Do I have a circumstance? Yes, I have a circumstance. The first one, that the accounts are wrong, that the accounts are misstated, that if management, the question said that the intangible assets do not meet the criteria for capitalization. So they have accounted for it as an asset, but they should not. Do I have one of the circumstances? Yes, the accounts are wrong. The accounts are misstated. Is it material? Yes, I've calculated it, and therefore I am saying that I will give a qualified except for opinion because of the material misstatement. So again, if you know that you're struggling to arrive at the correct opinion, you need to go back looking at the audit reports questions, making sure that you know how to deal with this and you can identify it. And besides just identifying the qualified opinion, that's just a half mark. There are 8 half marks here. Where else in my answer, what do I need to have in my answer to get the required depth in my answer to be able to pick up 8 half marks? All right, so those were really the 5 main areas of the F8 exam. Just very quickly, some of the major weaknesses. In conclusion, the time management issue, not answering all the question set, poor knowledge. You cannot expect to go into this exam where there are lots of knowledge-based questions and not paying attention to the and not having the required knowledge. Sometimes questions ask you to write to have the answer in a columnar format. Of course, that will not be an issue anymore for people who are attempting the CBE exams, because the CBE exams will have the columns there for you. The issue of regurgitation versus application, that a lot of us are literally just regurgitating information coming out of the question as opposed to using the information, writing a lot more than is required for 1 mark. I just dropped that in there, that the F8 exam had the lowest pass rate amongst all the foundation papers, and there are lots of reasons why. I think I described some of those reasons. One of them is, as I said, people are just really writing a lot more than is required for 1 mark in this exam. In terms of general exam technique pointers, make sure you work out your time allocations, ensure that you use the 15-minute reading time. I would possibly use the 15-minute reading time to begin the objective test questions. Please do not attempt that last in the exam. You want to attempt that first. Another reason why is sometimes working through those questions would kind of help you to remember something when you get to the written part of the exam. Reading the requirements carefully, it is one of the major downfalls in any exam when you are not reading carefully in the exam. How do you plan an audit is different from how do you plan the audit being this audit and using information from the scenario. Keeping your eye on the requirement. Always, there are students who start a question and begin answering the question, and then at the end have not answered the question because they are not keeping their eyes on the requirement and ensuring that you're answering a relevant answer. I have to state this, that there are lots of students rewriting the requirement. So the requirement in the exam, identify and explain the components of audit risk. And we are going into the exam saying the components of audit risk are, you don't need to rewrite the requirement. There are lots of students going into these exams not reading the technical articles. There are some very important ones at the top of the F8 website relating to assertions, relating to the new auditor's report. Good. And as I mentioned before, not having the adequate knowledge of accounting knowledge and auditing knowledge. There are lots of available resources on the ACCA website. Ensure that you're using these resources. The examiner's reports. The examiner's reports is another aspect of extremely important resources that people are not reading, and all of this is on the website under all of the technical articles. In terms of the computer-based exams, because a lot of us may be attempting the exam in June using computer-based exams, and knowing how to attempt these exams require a different level of preparation. There are areas on the ACCA website. I just had a screenshot there just showing you that the areas of the ACCA website that contains every single thing about computer-based exams. You have to go in there. You have to immerse yourself in some of the specimen CBE exams. You have to get a feel for it. You should be attempting some of the specimen exams. There are practice tests as well that you can purchase. Some of the tuition providers actually have, specimen exams. You have to immerse yourself into the CBE exam long before you go into the exam. It's a completely different dynamic. It's a completely different experience, and you can't go into the exam trying to figure out and stumbling and fumbling because you're not sure how to use the environment and the whole CBE thing because you have not practiced it. On top of trying to prepare for the exam, you have to know how to maneuver and how to deal with the CBE exams, right? And I just, this here as well, there's an overview of the CBE. There's a guide, there's a PDF guide to attempting F5 to F9. You need to get that guide. If anyone is unsure about where to go, I have some links here. You could feel free to send me a message through at the end, and I'll send you the links and the CB guide and that sort of thing. But these are resources that you need to be tapping into, good, to be able to put yourself in a position to pass these exams. If you have any further questions outside of the session, I'm not sure if you have any questions now at this point in time. We'll take a look at the questions just now. Feel free to send me. I have my contact details there. I have some online F8 revision recordings spanning a period of about 3 days with about 20-something questions, if anyone is interested. But the last thing that I would like to say is that a lot of students are attempting these exams, going into these exams only because an exam window has come around, as opposed to putting themselves in a position to pass these exams. To pass these exams, you ought to be drilling these questions, the bank of exam questions, 2-3 times minimum, so that when you go into the exam, if you have done 5 ethics questions back to back, if you have done 5 internal controls questions right after each other, the 6th one is going to become very easy. You're going to start to see the trends. You're going to start to see the patterns. If you've done 5 audit risk questions, trust me, a lot of the audit risks that you would see in those 5 questions that you just attempted, you're going to see them over and over. And if you've had the necessary question practice under your belt, you're going to go into the exam and see things that are very familiar to you. But a lot of students are struggling with these exams because they're just simply not putting in the required practice that is required. These are professional exams that are meant to be done over 6 months, or at least over a consistent stretch of adequate preparation to put yourself to pass in a position to pass these exams. All right, so that is basically it in terms of the presentation. I'm not sure if we have any questions. I just probably could hand it over to Tweeps. Not sure if we have any questions there, Tweeps.
I don't see any questions, but I'll give people just a few more minutes if there's some burning question you have for Shamid. Otherwise, he did have his contact information up. We did record this session, so it'll be available for you to listen to again. And I guess since I am not seeing anyone furiously typing, I want to thank Shamid very much for joining us today. This good information, and thank you for joining us as well. And with that, we will end this session. Thanks again.
All right, thank you, everyone.